morning, everybody.
Shut off your lab real quick so
Okay.
feedback into it.
God bless. Thanks a lot. My name is Ron J. Miller, and what I wanted to talk about this morning is something that I've been doing research on over the last year or so. And within the last 3 months, I've read about this idea and heard about it in a couple of places that have caused me to think that 2013 may be the year that the notion of narrative as the organizing principle for how brands and other institutions communicate may become part of our lexicon. What I'm going to present this morning is an assemblage of ideas. I am indebted to Clay Shirky, the author of Here Comes Everybody, John Hagel of Deloitte, who runs the appropriately named Center for the Edge out in Silicon Valley, and Professor David Bourget at the University of New Mexico. When I post this to SlideShare, I will make sure there are links to their works so that you can see what they are doing. And it all basically surrounds the notion of what is the difference between storytelling and narrative. But before I go there, I have a story I want to tell you. This is the Shinto shrine at Ise, Japan. It was built in 690 AD, and it was built by a group of monks who are still there from timbers in the adjacent forest. The purpose of this temple is to separate sacred space from ordinary space. It's a very popular shrine, and the Japanese government decided that they would go to UNESCO and have UNESCO place this temple on the Global Registry of Historical Sites. UNESCO looked at the application and they said no way. And the reason they said no way is in order to get on the registry, the building has to be at least 200 years old. And they said, it's made out of wood. There's no way that building was built in 690 and still exists today. And the monks said, well, of course not. In fact, what they do is, as the wood rots, eventually what they do is they hold a ceremony and they burn the temple down. They clear the site, they go in and they mill more lumber from the same forest, and according to painstaking plans, completely rebuild the temple exactly as it was. Now, the problem here is that UNESCO is in the edifice memorialization business. The monks are in the business of separating sacred space from ordinary space. The monks, as far as they're concerned, the temple's been there for 1,500 years and will be there for, God willing, another 1,500 years. But for UNESCO, it's meaningless because it's not the same edifice. And it occurs to me that this same kind of notion is a notion that we are going through during these chaotic times as we're struggling with how we are able to reach customers with a brand or with an institution. We get hung up on the edifice rather than what's inside. And what I'd like to talk about is what's inside for a brand. Oh, okay, thanks. I'll wave at Jeff, and Jeff will change. I'm convinced that we live in a miraculous generation. I believe that the transformations that we are seeing in information processing technologies and global telecommunications technologies are transforming the way human beings interact in a way at least as significant as the invention of the printing press. Please stay awake over there. So the bad news is we're surrounded by chaos. And continually, some of you may be familiar with the work by the television critic Bob Garfield, who about 5 years ago wrote an essay called The Chaos Scenario. And in the chaos scenario, he said, we have all of these traditional channels of broadcasting for reaching audiences, and they are disintegrating. Newspapers, magazines, all of that's disintegrating. Interruption and adjacency advertising is disintegrating, and the problem is there's nothing to replace it. So you see things like this if you're working with a brand where, how do we reach all the touch points of the customer? And there are intricate systems that are being built to try and target and retarget people with what's left of interruption and adjacency media. So we come up with stories. At South by Southwest, there were 122 sessions that had storytelling in the title. The problem with stories is that they have a beginning, a middle, and an end. That's one problem. The second problem is your job is to listen, and that's it. It's not about you, it's about me, or it's about them, but it's not about you. And that's the problem with relying on the notion of stories. I think all great brands have at the center, as Dr. Brown has pointed out, the notion of love and passion. Those of us who work in social networks know that what attracts people in social networks is more or less love or passion in some form. Back in 2008, Keith Olbermann had a great line about Barack Obama's campaign in 2008. He said, Hillary Clinton ran the last great presidential campaign of the 20th century. Barack Obama ran the first great presidential campaign of the 21st century. Robert Novak, the conservative columnist, said that one of the things he found really unique about Obama's campaign was he said it was the first time he had ever seen a campaign where the signs did not have the candidate's name on them. Change we can believe in. That was the idea. It wasn't about Barack Obama. It was about us, or at least that's what the narrative of the campaign was. The second thing is that the narrative, as I have come to understand it, is not the communications or even the communications between us. The narrative is the actions. The actions are the proof point of what is becoming the narrative that we rely on when we make our decisions. An example here of Obama, the proof points were, I believe, the consecutive primary victories that he had that proved that his campaign was going to be successful, that change we can believe in could successfully happen. And every time, that was one of the advantages of having so many primaries, was that every time he won a primary, his campaign gained credibility. So, I'm betraying some of my political allegiances now, but I will tell you I was a delegate for Barack Obama. And I went through the community organizer training that all of the people involved in the campaign did. And an astounding thing happened at the first meeting. It was a group almost this size, and it was being led by a woman from South Carolina who was a longtime organizer for Obama. And the first thing she did was she said, I want to go around the room and I want to have each one of you tell me why you're supporting Barack Obama. And the first person got up and said, my name's Steve and I, think it's time for a change. I think we've had on and on and on. And you can imagine what the stories were like. Each one was unique. In my case, I said I have two daughters, one of whom has never known a president other than George W. Bush. I want to see us turn the corner, and I'm tired of living in fear. I want to live in hope. So anyway, this thing went on for like 40 minutes, and I'm, like this. When it was done, the woman said, what you just said, that's what you communicate. Not policy positions, not grand ideas, nothing said by Barack Obama. That's what you communicate. So when we knocked on doors or when we were talking to friends, we were empowered to tell that story. It's that kind of belief system that we are invited into that I believe great companies, great brands, and I think in the future all large endeavors are going to be built upon. I would like to get credit for having the only presentation here that doesn't begin with Apple. Thank you. My father was a salesman for IBM. He joined IBM in 1954. His boss said, "It's a shame you've joined a company like this, Bob, because I have talked to scientists at the Pentagon, and they have told me, absolute outside, most ridiculous estimate, the entire United States needs about 150 computers." So clearly future prognostication is no indication of future results. IBM is a really interesting company for me. I grew up with it, and I work with people from IBM from time to time. The interesting thing about IBM was that 50 years ago, 90% of its revenues came from selling large mainframe computers. 10% came from professional services and software. Today, 90% of the revenue comes from professional services and software, and 10% comes from selling big hardware. Did IBM as a company change? Well, yes, of course. Did they change the essential narrative of the company? I don't think so. This was a common expression, especially amongst MIS managers in the late 80s and 90s, was nobody ever got fired for buying IBM. That's the narrative. That's the narrative that IBM shared with its customers. Next slide. This is actually how IBM would put it. We're the best partner you can have in data processing technology. We make our clients successful. It's not about IBM, it's about you. It's about your company. The narrative statement can never be, or the narrative idea is never about the company or the brand. It's about how you are invited in to participate in that narrative. Okay, I have to have an Apple slide. One of the ideas around Apple is that it is about you. The Apple narrative is we help you with technology that allows you to be creative. As I like to say, I don't believe in Steve Ballmer, I do believe in Steve Jobs. I won't stand in line overnight for a Windows phone. I might do that for the next iPhone or the next iPad. Go ahead. Narrative, when it's coherently expressed and lived within a company, provides stability in chaos. It provides an invitation to join. It is a belief system, and it provides direction and orientation. What I'm saying basically is the notion of marketing and messaging as a separate function still has a place, but really what we need to do is to think much more broadly about the entire enterprise. This is messaging that works from the inside out. If a company has a clear narrative, as I think IBM does, I think the receptionist ought to know what magazines to put on the coffee table in the reception area. I think the product manager in China, who's encountering an entirely new kind of market, ought to be able to solve that problem according to the principles of the narrative. It is kind of like the mission, but I think what it in narrative invites us to do is to invite others in to join in the form of customers. This is the Japanese word for crisis. It is comprised of two symbols. The symbols are danger, opportunity. There's an ambivalence there in the Japanese mind that I find. I just think the whole notion of kanji is kind of interesting, that you glyph an idea just in an instant. But this, I think, speaks to two different kinds of narrative that we see already at work in the marketplace. Threat-based narratives say something bad is going to happen unless we work together. The problem with, I think, the American political system is it is so dysfunctional that both the Republicans and the Democrats are coming to us with threat-based narratives. The Republican narrative is there are terrorists out there, there are people that are trying to tear down the fabric of our society, people trying to, there's the 47% who are takers as opposed to the 53% who are givers. All of that is threat-based narrative. The Democrats say, well, they're going to take apart Social Security, you won't have health care, grandma's going to be thrown out of the hospital. That's a threat-based narrative. What I think brands need to engage in are opportunity-based narratives. Apple invites us to be creative. IBM invites us to bring the most powerful technology for information and data processing and use it to make our business better. Narratives, I think, as this idea develops, I think the narrative of a company does need to be spoken out loud. And I think, most importantly, this is what I call an inside-out concept. I believe that if a company took, I'll be absurd here, half the media budget and spent it on internal communications, there would be a greater return on investment. Internal corporate communications, I think, is one of the new frontiers for brand marketers and for this idea of narrative. If you work for Target and you understand what Target's narrative is, you don't really need advertising, because if a customer walks into the store, they'll get it because they're engaging with you. So it's inside out. It, I think, needs to be about opportunities. It needs to be, it's not a destination so much. It's out there, journey. It's a journey that never has an end. A narrative is open-ended, and it also allows us to spin off stories that support and explain the narrative, but the narrative is really the open-ended journey that the corporation is going on. It's a quest, and it is most of all about action. Narrative forms. There is an idea or some research that you can organize this notion of narrative into 4 types. We have linear narratives. Christianity is a linear narrative. Man is born in sin, finds redemption through the Savior, and goes to heaven. It's a steady process that does have an end state out in the future. Cyclical narratives are what I just described about IBM. It's a company that's constantly going through a process of working its belief system into new forms. Spirals are, in effect, like cyclical narratives, but they are going off in different directions. AOL, and oftentimes are unsuccessful. AOL, I think, is a good example of a company that had an idea of where it was going, and then as the market disrupted it, continued, and in fact continues to spin in different directions, trying to reinvent the narrative of what AOL is. AOL to me was 56K dial-up, and now it's the Huffington Post. I don't think all of that is in any kind of a coherent evolution, and I think that's the challenge for AOL. The other kind is an assemblage narrative, and that's an example. Crowdsourcing, social networks are good examples of assemblage narratives. What Twitter is about as a brand is because of a lot of us here in the room. New York City is an assemblage narrative. What is New York City? What is Boston? What is the Twin Cities? What is Minibar? Minibar is about a lot of things, but it is an assemblage that comes together of different and disparate types building around a central theme. One aspect of developing a narrative is that you see companies developing 3 fundamental components of the narrative platform. One is a process for how we move through our cycles. The second is strategy, different strategic decisions as we move through time. Lou Gerstner joined IBM. He said, we don't need any mission. What we need is to execute. That was a strategic decision that continued the evolution of IBM. In addition to that, we build tools along the way so that as we enter into new cycles, we have resources and tools that we can use to leverage. A great example of this is Pixar. When Pixar started, the first film that they did was Toy Story. And if you notice, if those of you who remember it, there is a scene early on where there are toy Marines marching with their feet. That was the first scene that was shot. And the reason it was shot was because the characters were very simple. They didn't have hair, they didn't have intricate parts, they didn't have lips that moved. So all that the rendering software and the 3D software could do was that simple kind of animation. While they were actually creating the movie, their software development team was developing their rendering software. And the head of the rendering software team committed that 3 years out, the software would be good enough to do the kinds of complex animations that we also saw in Toy Story. So you guys were building the movie while you guys were building the software that these people would eventually need. That's a great example, and I have to say, Pixar is about the only movie brand I can think of where the studio lives as a quality brand. If you hear Pixar is coming out with a new movie, that's a lot different than hearing that Paramount is coming out with a new movie. Sam. Walmart. Walmart is a great example to me of a linear narrative. Started in Bentonville, Arkansas, started spreading all over the South, spread all over the United States. Walmart today runs the largest supply chain on the planet Earth. Their narrative is, we give you stuff cheaper. Okay? Spend less, live better. That's their slogan. The narrative is about, if I go to Walmart, that's the cheapest I can get that stuff. They will figure out a way. By the way, I heard an amazing statistic. There was like an enormous increase in US productivity between 2000 and 2005. McKinsey studied that. It was like a 26% year-on-year improvement in productivity. A lot of it was because of technology. 25% of that improvement in the US economy was in the Walmart supply chain. Okay? So that's how they do it. If you work inside Walmart, you know what the narrative is. What's this? Target. How can you tell? Red, wide aisles, bright lights. Well, I hadn't thought about that. Yeah. That's back here. That's back here tickling me. 200,000 square feet, large parking lots, suburban malls, all of that is part of Target's narrative. Target's narrative is different from Walmart's. Target's narrative is, we don't deliver value, we deliver quality. Okay? It's not expressed that way. I think Target should express it that way, at least internally. What we deliver, as opposed to Walmart, the Dark Star, the Death Star, what we deliver, we give you Isaac Mizrahi. I have a 16-year-old daughter, and went to buy a dress and found an Isaac Mizrahi bridesmaid's dress on sale for $80. And it's beautiful. She just looks gorgeous in it. That's not something that Walmart has the credibility, the ability, or the narrative to do. Dr. David Boji down at New Mexico, who has done a lot of research and writing about this, is half Native American. And in his Native American tribe, there's an expression. And they say somebody either has tree in head or grass in head. And tree in head is what he calls the symbol for a linear narrative, okay? There's a tree there, okay? So much of what we need to do in developing a narrative is to have grass in head. So we know what grass is. So it's a multitude, it's a field, it's directional. We see more of it. When we see more of it, we recognize it. Best Buy. What's Best Buy's narrative? You know what they say? Anybody here from Best Buy? I don't know. Anybody? Yes. We're the Best Buy? I heard an interesting idea when they started having trouble. Somebody said what they ought to do is get rid of all these stores, and instead of selling 150 TVs, sell 4 TVs. But they would be the Best Buy. And that's how they would deliver on the promise of Best Buy. It's an interesting notion. What is the narrative? It's something that Jolie and others here are starting to struggle with. What they would say is we solve puzzles for our customers. Okay, you want to buy a big screen TV and you're not sure which one, you go in and a night, yeah. Yeah. Right. They picked the spot. I put that up as an example of, I think, a company that could, if it's around 20 years from now, just like IBM had its time in the wilderness with Lou Gerstner, they may find that what their narrative is, and be able to refocus the company to create and to continue the journey. Go ahead. So, in summary, I think the notion of a narrative is a belief system that allows us to be highly aligned internally, but loosely coupled, so that each of us goes out and delivers on the mission of the narrative. We're motivated from within, and above all, it is about collaborating internally and collaborating with customers. Yonder. This is one of my favorite words. If I ever started an agency, I would call it yonder. Yonder, that's where we're going. Narrative is about yonder. And interestingly enough, the word yonder comes from 2 words. In the Old English, there is a word yond. And yond means not just something over there, it's something you and I are seeing, and we can see it, but it's in the distance. So that's one part of the idea of yonder. It's something that it's not here, it's not the next step, it's not the next step, but it's where we're journeying. The second part of the word is jorg, which is Old Dutch, and that means throughout. So the word together means that place there that we are journeying towards. And I think that's as good a summary as I can think of the thinking around the idea of narrative. Thank you. How much time? This is one of these ideas. First of all, I will say, by all means, look at the other people who are writing about this notion. This is just my thinking around it. I would welcome any ideas. I think it is the beginning of a discussion. In effect, it is our journey, our narrative about narrative. So, yes? I think that's a great question. Jeff and Andy had a session just before this about, you were there, and I got to say, again, the statement is, no, what's the statement of Andy's company? Yeah. We build bridges between systems and love. And what I love is that they've taken on the word love. That's a bold statement. It's not clever, it's not, catchy. You wonder where the yellow went when you brush your teeth with Pepsodent. It's something that you should be able to decide who you're going to hire based on that narrative. Because if we're getting this together, if we're journeying together, this is the idea that our narrative is built around. So, the reason I picked companies that had long histories is I think they're great examples of how companies wander, trying to find their narrative, trying to get back to their narrative. Yes? Yes. Yes, and I think there are components that grow out of that. There's this idea of anti-narrative, which is the story that came before where we are now. There's an origin story. Primal Branding, written by a fellow here in the Twin Cities, talks about the story of origin. We all know the story of origin of Apple. And it is proof along the way of exactly this. And I saw just a disheartening research study yesterday. 46% of all of the senior people surveyed in 500 corporations in America couldn't give a damn. You know, they're mailing it in, okay? They don't believe in management. Management comes in with this cascading idea. CEO comes up with the idea and just assumes that it'll ladder all the way down the organization. As I say, that combines the worst aspects of the game of telephone with the worst aspects of dictatorship. And that's why I think more than anything else, what's the action that should come out of this idea of narrative? I think it is understanding the narrative in the center of the company, and I'm working out. Yes, ma'am. Great notion, yeah. And I think there was a question people asked, you know, how does one develop a narrative for a product or a service and then communicating that? And I think it starts with, I think that's what real leadership is in the 21st century. You have to figure out what that narrative is, communicate it across your organization, because the ability to command and control an organization is impossible in this chaos. The only way you can do it is by communicating a belief system, a narrative throughout the company, and then allowing people to be responsible for their actions. So, thanks a lot, everybody. Really appreciate it. Thank you.